will now go to Senator Ludlam.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a couple of follow-up questions based on what a couple of other senators have raised with you already this morning. I'm particularly interested, I guess, in how IA responds when you get a change of government. Previous government in Western Australia had pretty clear priorities, cost them government as it happens, but their priorities were at least clear. The incoming government has very different priorities. So specifically drawing your attention to the Perth Freight Link. Firstly, maybe through you, Minister, if I may, could you provide the committee with a full copy of the business case and the full cost benefit analysis for the Perth Freight Link?
Perhaps if I may.
Sure.
My understanding, Senator, is that material has been publicly released.
Has it? Well, I wasn't expecting a good bit of news first thing in the morning at an estimates committee on Monday. That's extremely rare. If you can point us to the source of that, unless it's simply that the WA government's put them into the public domain. Is that your understanding?
Certainly there was material released by the former Western Australian government in relation to the Perth Freight Link business plan.
No. I'm not talking about the talking points, the top line or the exact summary with big black bits redacted out of it, the full business case and the full CBA. So I knew it was too good to be true.
It's a matter of business.
Well, certainly I'm only familiar with the material that was released by the former West Australian government,
Okay.
Senator.
No.
The further release of information in relation to the Perth Freight Link would be a matter for the West Australian government.
Yeah, except that it was the Commonwealth writing out the cheques. I want to put it formally through you, Minister. Will the government table a copy of those documents now? The reason that I'm raising this is that the Minister in the chamber or at other times when I've tried to get these documents into public domain has said we're being prevented from releasing those because the Western Australian government doesn't want us to. They've been swept out of office in a landslide, so I'm just putting that question to you again.
Again, if I can just be clear, Senator, the documents are those of the West Australian government. If the new West Australian government chooses to release those documents, that will be a matter for the West Australian government.
All right. To be continued. It's amazing how long we've been at this. I was fascinated. I think it was Senator Gallagher raised the question before about the incoming Labor government's priorities, which are different. They're around, in part, passenger rail rather than the Perth Freight Link. That there was an announcement, unlike what happened in Victoria, there was an announcement fairly shortly afterwards by the Commonwealth that they would back funding for those projects. But I think I just heard you say to Senator Gallagher that there have been no CBAs, there have been no business case presented to you. So just tell us how you are able to make these announcements without any of that due process having occurred.
The Australian government has committed to a range of projects put forward by the new West Australian government. Funding for those projects will be subject to the development of business cases, particularly for those projects over $100 million. They'll need to be submitted to Infrastructure Australia prior to any release of Australian, and they'll need to complete that assessment process by Infrastructure Australia before any Australian government funding is released.
The government already announced they're going to fund it though. Doesn't that make what you're doing a bit redundant?
I think if you look at the Australian government announcement, it makes clear that projects, particularly those large projects, are all subject to completing the Infrastructure Australia assessment processes.
But they've already said they're going to fund them.
As I said, the announcement is very clear. It says subject to completing Infrastructure Australia assessment processes for those projects over $100 million individually.
I've got to say I support new passenger rail in Western Australia, so don't get me wrong, but I think fair's fair. We fought you tooth and nail over preemptive funding for the very unpopular freeway project on the basis that due process appeared to have been completely back-ended. Announcement is made, funding is committed, and now you and your team have to go back and retrospectively justify it on the basis of documents that the public can't see. I guess I'd like to see would be nice to know, I suppose, that your process is given, such as it is given the priority that it deserves rather than preemptive funding announcements being made. Doesn't that put pressure on your assessors and your analysts to make sure that the numbers do stack up? Because there's a lot politically riding on it once an announcement's been made.
Well, firstly, there's a lot of work to be done by the incoming West Australian government to prepare those project business cases.
That's true.
There is a lot of work to be done in relation to the large rail projects. They are at a very early stage, most of those. That work will need to take place over the next 1 to 2 years. That's been the West Australian government position. The Australian government position is that Infrastructure Australia assessment processes will need to be met before any Australian government's funds are provided to those projects.
Is it the case that the 2017-18 budget papers still state that the government's committed to the Perth Freight Link?
Yes, Senator, the
Is that a
Australian
misprint?
government... Sorry?
Is that a misprint? Is
No,
that
Senator,
typo?
the Australian government has provided in the contingent liabilities in the budget that should a future West Australian government proceed with the Perth Freight Link,
That's amazing.
the Australian government's funding will be available to that project.
They really don't learn, do they? It just costs them government.
Well,
That's-
you and I could argue over that, Senator Ludlam, and I don't think you're going to ask the Secretary to give an opinion, but on this point I'd
No,
certainly
but I'm
be
happy
have
to-
a
I'm happy to share
$2
mine, though.
scratchy with anybody that will eventually be built. Row 8 will be built. But
I will-
anyhow,
I'll
we're
take-
here to ask the Secretary questions.
I will take your $2
Thank
scratchy.
you very much. Will
Senator
you,
Back.
Senator Stelling?
It's on Hansard. No, that project is done, and it's remarkable, and it's a bit of an insult to the people of Western Australia that the Commonwealth still thinks this dead thing can somehow be resurrected.
Again, that's an opinion that I'm sure you wouldn't ask the Secretary to comment on.
I wouldn't dream of doing such a thing.
Wonderful.
Can we come to the Murdoch Avenue extension? Is there any correspondence between the federal government and your state counterparts about that project?
Yes, Senator, there was some advice in requesting the reallocation of Perth Freight Link money. The West Australian Government did set out a range of projects that it sought to have funded.
Yep.
So my understanding, and I'll check with my officers, is that there is a funding request from the West Australian Government that has been made in relation to that project.
Okay. That's like an omnibus funding request, and that's one of the components of it.
That's correct, Senator. The detail of that project is yet to be determined, including, as I said, the normal completion of all of our either departmental or, if the project is over $100 million, as I mentioned earlier,
Yep.
IA processes, which will need to be met.
Could I just put to you, can you just describe for us whether or not that Murdoch Ave extension would hit that $100 million threshold?
It is above.
Yeah, I'll ask Ms Garvin
Much
to
appreciated.
give you information in relation to that project, Senator.
Christina Garvin, Acting General Manager in Northwest Infrastructure Branch. Yes, Senator, the Murdoch Access Activity Centre access roads will reach the threshold of 100 million Australian government contribution.
If you've got a document there, and maybe just to save the committee time because we're about to break, are you able to table either the document you're reading from or something that's appropriate for the committee to see of each of the components of that omnibus funding request that would hit that $100 million threshold? Because I guess that tells us a bit about how much back-end work your team will need to do.
I'd take that on notice if you don't mind,
Yeah, if you
Senator.
can.
I'll just see what we can provide through the course of the morning.
Be interested to know
Otherwise-
which are above and which are below that
Certainly,
threshold.
Senator. We have indicative... the WA government has provided indicative estimates around each of those projects, but with work yet to happen on a large number of them, I'll take on notice and come back to you as quickly as I can.
Sorry, Senator, if I can just correct what I just said. The total project cost is estimated around 120, which means the Australian government contribution is just below 100 for that project.
Isn't that interesting? So if the state top-up keeps it above, keeps the Commonwealth contribution below 100 million, a whole pile of your assessment work doesn't have to happen.
The Infrastructure Australia assessment work is not required. However, the department's assessment under project proposal reports, which are required under legislation,
Yep.
would still be required.
Though they still need a PPR.
That's
but what doesn't happen?
The broader economic analysis, which is undertaken by Infrastructure Australia.
Okay. We are out of time, but if I can just leave that request with you, if you could just break out for us which are the components.
Senator,
Yeah, shoot.
Mark Tomlin, Executive Director, Infrastructure Investment Division. The media release of 7th of May breaks out all the...
Does?
Yeah, all the
Brilliant.
components.
All right, I'm done. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Ludlam. We'll break for morning tea.